Good afternoon. Thank you so much for joining us. We'll get started in 1 minute. Welcome to Pearson's Literacy Author Webinar Series. My name is Jamie Downey, and I'm the Director of Product Marketing for Elementary Literacy. Our goal with this webinar series is to help educators and students alike adapt to the challenges of distance learning. We've assembled a dedicated team of authors and experts to share best practices, strategies, and resources during these unprecedented times. We are so excited to have Dr. Judy Wallis here today to share with you some best practices for supporting students' comprehension instruction during remote learning. Dr. Judy Wallis has spent the past 4 decades as a teacher, literacy coach, university instructor, and staff developer. Her professional focus is on reading comprehension, writing, and whole school district change through literacy instruction. Judy's publications include The Blue Pages and Conversations with Reggie Routman, and Comprehension Intervention, grades K through 2, and Comprehension Intervention, grades 3 through 6, with Stephanie Harvey and Ann Gudvis. Dr. Wallis has shared her vast expertise with us in the development of MyView Literacy, our newest K-5 literacy solution. I'm so honored to have her with us today. Before I turn it over to Judy, I just have some quick housekeeping items to mention. Each of you should have a control panel that looks like this. At the end of Judy's presentation, you will have a chance to ask her some of your burning questions. Since there are over 500 of you in this session today, your lines are muted. However, you can type your questions into the question field shown on the screen at any time, and Judy will do her best to answer as many as she can. To ensure you are connected to audio, please check the audio section of your attendee panel to ensure you have computer audio selected and the correct output selected as well. I've put the call-in number in the question field if you're having trouble connecting to audio via your computer. Additionally, Dr. Wallis has provided some handouts, including a how to read each genre toolkit, a poetry scaffolding resource document, and her presentation slides. You can find those in the handout section of your GoToWebinar control panel. Without further ado, I will turn it over to Dr. Judy Wallis.
Hi, everyone. It's great to see you this afternoon, if only virtually. I suppose, like you, we're all learning new things that we didn't anticipate learning without the luxury of the gradual release model. We've all sort of been thrown into a new world. And so today I hope to offer you some suggestions that will help you in teaching children and helping them grow more successful as readers, even at a distance. So I'm going to switch over now and show my screen, and we'll start the slides. One of the things that I know we're all struggling with is how to foster the kind of engagement that we are eager to have in our students. And one of the very best books that I know of is Ellen Keene's book, Engaging Children. And in that book, she introduces 4 pillars of engagement. And so I thought these were a great way for us to start today in thinking about how do we engage the kids at a distance, and what can we do? Are there some things that we can actually do to ensure that they are with us in not only just present, but actually engaged? One of the ones that Ellen talks about is the intellectual urgency. And somehow we have to, I think, model that. We have to show kids that we're excited and anxious and to learn more and curious. And so I think that so much of this is going to depend upon the platform that we use and how we can touch kids through the virtual ways in which we're working. I think
And
also
Dr. Wallis, I'm sorry, Dr. Wallis, we're not seeing your slides any longer. We're still seeing your beautiful face, but we're not able to see your slides at the moment.
Okay.
There we go.
Okay. Can you see the slides now?
Yes, ma'am, we sure can.
Okay.
Thank you.
All right. And so we know that one of the things that we have to do is get kids engaged not only with their head, but also with their heart. And I've been having some great conversations with many of my students at the University of Houston, making sure that that we touch each other both in terms of our heads, but also our hearts and with our emotions. Uh, the next one is one that we'll talk about later, and I think it's something that we can really utilize, and that's the idea of perspective bending. Ellen talks about the idea that others affect our thinking and we affect theirs, and so in some of the ideas that I'll offer today, I believe that there will be ways for us to perspective bend. And then finally, making sure that kids are drawn to the beauty of literature, the beauty of ideas, the wonderful curiosity that we want to engender in them. And a lot of that again is the way you and I uh, constantly model that for students. Uh, in we have to scaffold for our students. We have to make sure that our students are supported even when we're working with students at a distance. So there are some things that we can do to scaffold students remotely. And one of those is we can make sure that we model. And I think that modeling is a little more challenging, but I found that sometimes just making a video of my doing something that I would do in the classroom works very well. And so the students have the opportunity to watch that video and to see the performance that I am engaging them in. Scaffolds can be part of a text too, and we'll you look at some examples of how you can put scaffolds right in the text for kids. And then they can be also in the form of outlining a process. And the poetry scaffold that I'll be talking about shortly is one of the ways that you can do that. And scaffolding doesn't mean in any way simplifying a task, but it may mean that we either increase or decrease our level of support based upon kids. When I'm planning, I'm thinking about three things as I'm planning the work that I do with students on comprehension. The first is, what genre is the text and what is the text structure? Because I know that we've discovered that the text structure and the genre and kids knowing and having an understanding of that is essential and may be just as important in comprehension as the kinds of thinking we want them to do. I want to think about the kind of thinking that kids will do in the text that they'll be using. And that is, those are all the comprehension strategies. So all the cognitive work that we want them to do. And then finally, I want to make sure that the language I use about both thinking and about genre and text structure is clear for kids, because we want to have that language to talk about text in a way that is meaningful and helpful to students. Here's a quick review of those comprehension strategies. They've been around a very long time. We have people like David Pearson to thank for these strategies. As they studied proficient readers, these were the things that they saw those proficient readers doing. One of the ones that is particularly challenging, I think, for all of us is inferring. And so that's one that we're going to have to pay great attention to in making sure that our kids have the kind of scaffolds and helps that they need to make those inferences, drawing conclusions, making predictions, and creating the kinds of visual information in the head that we want them to. So what does scaffolding look like then, long distance? That's the $64,000 question, isn't it? So we're going to look at some of the possibilities, and I hope you'll see that these are easy to do and also robust in terms of making sure that kids grow more successful as readers and writers and thinkers. The first one that I want to talk about is thinking aloud. And you and I have done lots and lots of thinking aloud in front of kids, I know. But now we have a very different kind of think aloud where we have to do it in a kind of virtual way. As I mentioned earlier, I think you can use any platform. Sometimes it's easiest for me to make a quick video of the Think Aloud so that students have the text that I'm using, but they're listening and watching as I think aloud that all about that inner conversation that's going on in my head. I always think that short texts are best, and you can choose any genre, but the one that I have positioned on the page right here is Bore Out There from Every Living Thing by Cynthia Rylant, which is an absolute goldmine of short pieces of text to use in the classroom. As you think aloud, we're modeling the inner conversation. And I know all of us have been with kids, and you say, what is that voice inside your head saying? And kids will say, nothing. And we have to make kids aware. It's not that their voice is saying nothing. It's just that we have to tune them in to their voice. So we do that by paying attention to the genre characteristics, to text structure, to any of the literary elements. So when the text begins to in a literature piece of literature, when it begins to have tension, we call attention to kids so that they see that. Also, we call attention in informational text to all the text features and how, as readers, we're using those text features. We also want to call attention to the confusions that kids might have, and we want to make sure that they see that we have some of those same confusions. So it's perfectly it's so important for us to model those confusions. And as much as possible, we need to make those confusions authentic and ones that we're really confused about, places in the text. And then occasionally stopping for unfamiliar vocabulary or vocabulary that's used in a new and unique way, perhaps in a text. Remember that we're doing the modeling uh, for what kids will actually do. And so the clearer and more apt and lively that can be, the better. So we want kids to see an authentic performance. Say Something has been around a long time. Um, Jerry Harsty and a group of colleagues, I think I first encountered it way back in the 80s. It was in a book that they authored. And I found Say Something as one of the very best possibilities for making sure that our kids are stopping and making reading an active process. So, Say Something went like this. Two kids would sit side by side and they would mark some places in the text to stop and say something. They would have that conversation about the content, about the genre, what's happening in the text, any questions that they were having, and then they would read on. Well, when we don't have kids sitting side by side, one of the things that we can do is to encourage kids to say something silently. And one of the ways that we can do that is helping them to find places in the text to stop. We call it chunking, and they stop and talk about what they've read so far. One of the most challenging things, especially for striving readers, is when they are reading along and they become confused, or as we say, lost in a text, not in a good way. Um, the kids the kids just keep reading, and so say something and say something silently ensures that kids are monitoring for meaning and making sense of their reading. So what I've done here is a couple of things. I think we can scaffold for kids by actually putting little call outs for them in a piece of text. The piece of text that I'm using right now comes from textproject.org, Freddie Hebert's wonderful site that is absolutely filled with incredible articles that I use all the time. The nice thing about that site is those articles are in 5 different levels. But you can see what I've done is I've tried to model the process for reading an article. And so I've asked the kids at the very top to think about what they know about the genre first, and then also to think about what they know about the content. And so kids are beginning to activate their prior knowledge, which we know makes an enormous difference. I talk to kids when I'm sharing this process that it's a little bit like building a frame like you do in working a puzzle, a jigsaw puzzle, where you put the outline pieces together first and then you work through putting all those little bitty pieces together. The frame that we build is a frame that then it's the big ideas, we can put the smaller bits and pieces of details within that larger frame. The kids then would move to read all the photos, and I always make a kind of joke about this. Um, and kids will look at me and say, "You really want me to read the photograph?" And I'll say, "Absolutely, read the photograph. Tell me what's going on in the photograph." And in some cases, it's important for kids to activate, to turn that photograph into a movie. And then I want them to think about what the title and the photos predict about what they'll read. And then I want them to make sure that they pre-plan some places to stop. And so I put some little stars in this text at places where I want kids to stop, think about what they've read so far, summarize it, move on, and then add, as they stop a second or a third time, add the new information to what they've read previously. So say something, as well as scaffolding a process for students is a terrific way to ensure that our kids have that sense of support, even though we're not right by their sides. We can scaffold thinking in a text excerpt. The first time I did this was many years ago, and it really was cut and paste. And I mean the old-fashioned kind of cut and paste. So I would take a text of a great piece of literature, and I would then type little questions off to the side to give kids a sense of what they might be thinking about and asking themselves the kinds of inferences that they'd be making at that moment, so that they were active readers. The nice thing about scaffolding is you can scaffold heavily at the beginning and decrease the scaffolds as you go, so that kids take on more and more responsibility. So that gradual release model is so important for us to remember in scaffolding, because at some point we have to begin to take scaffolds down so that kids move on their own. Using a scaffold for reading poetry is one of my favorites, and I have to give a plug right here to a former friend who is unfortunately no longer with us, Paul Janesco. And Paul was a great poet and a great anthologist, and I was helping work on a book that he was writing. And as I was reading, he had some really terrific ideas that gave me the idea of creating a scaffold for reading poetry. And so the scaffold we've been using, I guess, for maybe close to 10 years now. And what's terrific about it is that teachers tell me they use the scaffold before sharing poetry with kids so that they better understand it. But it's probably one of the things that we've had the most success with. And one of the things that I absolutely recommend that kids know the scaffold as they're approaching any kind of test taking, so that they have a way to approach poetry. So that's one of the handouts you have that has a bit more information. So the first step is just to meet the poem. I think that you and I probably remember that those moments of terror when a question came, "What did Robert Frost mean?" is the first time we read the poem. And our hope is that we can ease kids into poetry. So we want them just to meet the poem. I say, shake hands with the poem. Just read it and enjoy it this first time. And then let's read it closely. Let's think, let's slow our reading down and think about the poet's ideas and the kinds of images the poet is creating. And this is where I often mark up the poem. I usually have it posted on an anchor chart, and I mark up the poem as I'm reading this doing this close reading so that the kids actually see the thoughts that we're having as we read. And then we look back at the poem, but this time we're looking at the mood. And I put three faces in the O and the O and the D to help kids remember that that I'm always looking for words and for a sense of the feelings in the poem, the feelings that the poet is creating. And then finally, we look at the form. We consider the arrangement of the lines and the line breaks and the stanza breaks and the punctuation and different fonts. So I know sometimes people say, well, do you really have kids read the poem 4 times? And the answer is no, they're not really reading the poem 4 times. They are reading it twice when they meet the poem and then when they read it closely. But when they look back for mood, they're more selective and looking for patterns of words or images. And when we look at the form, we're actually looking at the physical aspects. So let me take you through a couple of slides that will show you how this might work. And the reason it works is because poetry is an economy of words. And so poets are on a word budget. I tell kids they don't have the luxury that Jerry Spinelli did when he wrote Maniac Magee. They can use, they use fewer words. So the words have to work hard and the reader has to work hard. So there's lots of inferring to do. And because I've slowed down the process and given kids multiple opportunities to dip back into the poem and shift lenses when we do, they are much more successful in reading poetry. And I want to remind all of us that when we start with a whole, it's so much, the quality of learning is so much better because great learning starts with the whole and then looks at the parts. So here's a poem that I love. It's from an anthology by Lee Bennett Hopkins. It's called At the State Fair. And I'll read it quickly. The Ferris wheel stops in the air halfway. My small metal seat dangles and sways over pink spinning teacups, boats bobbing on lakes. I'm trapped on top of the world by mistake, kidnapped by sky. Suspended in air, I stay very still in this chandelier chair. Breathless I wait, my heart skips a beat. Frozen I sit in this teetering seat. I grip the cold bar, my knuckles turn white. Nothing but darkness and moon in sight. Bring me down, bring me down. I struggle to shout, but the wheel stands still and nothing comes out. So we talk about what's happening in the poem. We just meet the poem. In close reading, I want kids to notice things, and so I typically underline and circle, and I've tried to do a little bit of this on the computer, but you can see it would be much more effective if I were doing it on an anchor chart. But I want kids to notice certain things, and I want kids to be inferring as we go, because as I said before, poetry is intended for the reader to be as much of a player in the authoring of the content as the poet is. And so you see some of the things that I would likely point out in that close read. When we're talking about mood, we're thinking about all those words that that might be mood kind of words. And so you notice that we have some words underlined. And if you think about the words that are underlined, you can see that there's a pattern developing: trapped and dangles and sways and suspended and kidnapped. And so kids are beginning to realize that the mood in this poem is one of suspense. And finally, we're looking at the form, and looking at the form is where we consider the lines, the line breaks. We're looking for the shortest lines, and I tell kids that poets could have continued to write. There was plenty of space to continue their thought, but they broke the line for a very specific reason. We also want to look at the shape of the poem and how the poet has placed the poem on the page. We all are familiar with E. E. Cummings and how he danced words and letters all over the page in his poems. So we know that looking at those sorts of things is absolutely critical. And then thinking about that line, bring me down, and the ellipses that follow that line. So poetry is so much fun when we feel as though we have agency, as Peter Johnston talks about over reading a poem. And we find that this poetry scaffold does just that for kids and for us too. Online book clubs, I hope that we're utilizing those. I can tell you that they work because in the early 1990s, we participated in an online book club, believe it or not, in Alief, where I was the language arts director. And we were on an online book club with kids all over the United States. And I can remember the excitement the day that we were reading The Watsons Go to Birmingham. And I can remember the excitement when Christopher Paul Curtis actually dropped into the book club and made comments. So book clubs can be organized in lots of ways where kids are reading the same book, but they can also be organized where kids are reading different books. And we'll look at that in just a moment. So one of the things that I find that works well is to make sure that kids have focus questions. And those focus questions can be scaffolded across the book according to what you'd like kids to notice. And so those questions, and I do have lists of questions. If anyone's interested, I certainly am willing to share that. For older students, Bob Probst has a wonderful old article called Dialogue with the Text. And so if we give kids a focus question, then they can respond in a Zoom kind of context. They can respond to that focus question, or they can type in responses, or they can write responses. So in this case, the kids might have been reading Sharon Draper's wonderful book, Out of My Mind. And so the focus question early on in the book would be, what are you inferring about melody? I think one thing that we can perhaps be more intentional about during these days when we're all struggling to figure out how to keep kids engaged and also to make the learning meaningful. If we can pair text in a way that kids will actually see two different texts, but that have some similar plots. And I've put two here that I've used before with kids, Out of My Mind and Mockingbird. And we can engage kids in conversations about the idea of character similarities. We know that making text-to-text connections is one of the most powerful ways that readers grow. And of course, the more we read, the more connections we make. So giving kids the opportunity to read two texts, to look closely at each of the two texts, and then to think across two texts. And even giving kids choices. Notice at the bottom that I've offered up several different questions. I'm finding giving kids choices is an amazing motivator, certainly in the classroom, but I'm finding it with my students at the university that in the last few assignments that I had to revamp because we went to an all online format. I'm beginning to add options so that kids have choices in how they in the kind of thing that they're answering. So I really commend the idea of offering kids not just one question, but several questions that they might respond to. When we do online book clubs, I wanted to back up and say that we might have, if you look at all the students around the focus question, there might be 4 of these sort of satellites and 4 different texts. And I think that that's a terrific way not only to give kids choices, but also what Nancy Atwell called it will cause kids to engage in literary gossip. And so when kids are reading different texts, it's really exciting for them to hear peers talk about a different text. And we're selling books for kids' future independent reading in that way. Finally, one of the things that I did probably a few years ago now, it's been a while, but I realized that kids, so many kids read generically. And they approach the reading of an article in the same way they approach the reading of a piece of traditional literature or a poem. And I wanted somehow to show kids that they needed to think about the genre that they were reading. And certainly content is important, but the genre and text structure will ease kids' access to meaning in ways that we might not have imagined. So I made this little set. It's intended to be kind of cut up into cards. And when you're working with one particular genre, it's helpful to give the kids one of these cards as a sort of culminating opportunity to relook at what they've learned about reading a particular genre. And then when we're getting close, the real reason I made this was I found that as we were getting close to our state test, that I wanted kids to be flexible as readers. And so I would give them these cards and we'd review how we'd approach each of those pieces of writing so that as readers, we would come away with enhanced comprehension and a sense of, as I mentioned before, a sense of agency. So these are challenging times for sure. And I was on Facebook earlier, and one of my former colleagues in Spring Branch was lamenting how challenging this was and how little sleep she was getting. And I think, and I typed her a message, and it's a message that I'd like all of us, including myself, to take to heart. We need to be kind to ourselves. And we need to remember, as Brene Brown says, that courage starts with showing up and letting ourselves be seen. So uh, we're all in new territory. I had to record a video twice because I didn't do the sound right the other day, and so we're making mistakes along the way. But I think as long as we're courageous and and understand that we are vulnerable at this time, and for sure this new world that we're in, the new normal, is a leveler for all of us. We're sort of all learners in this together. So that concludes the planned part of this, and so I'll be happy to entertain questions and talk with you about anything that is of interest to you.
Thank you so much for the thoughtful and inspiring words today, Dr. Wallis. We're going to take questions. Oops, pardon me. We're going to take questions for the next few minutes. There's been a number of requests come through in the chat asking for those wonderful focus questions for book clubs. So we will work with Dr. Wallis and get those posted to the literacy webinar author series blog page, so that you can access those, as well as the great resources that Dr. Wallis has provided for already in the handout session. Today we'll also be posting the recording of this session. Just wanted to remind you really quickly that if you want to learn any more about our Pearson literacy programs, including free access, you can go to pearsonschool.com/literacy, as you see on your screen. And because we know that you all are undertaking heroic efforts right now, we have worked very hard to provide you with resources across our literacy solutions. So please access mypearsontraining.com/coronavirus for free resources to support you, in addition to these amazing resources that Dr. Wallis has provided today. Without taking any more time on that, I'm going to start the Q&A session, and we will take about 10 minutes. So there have been a number of questions that have come in. Thank you so much. If you have if you have a question and you haven't submitted it, please go on and do so at this time. And Dr. Wallis, one educator wrote in and said, I'm having a hard time locating text to share with my students virtually. Do you have any recommendations?
Yeah, I think sharing text virtually, I think, can happen in a variety of ways. One, I think that we can we can certainly project the text, but another way is to actually have a text that kids can download and or at least look at on a screen. I love to use short poems. Poetry is one of the things that is readily available on the internet. I think that Freddie Hubert's site, textproject.org, has wonderful text selections, and you might even consider using some of the text selections with kids from that site. So I think there are ways for us to do it. I type up a lot of text. The one you saw from Every Living Thing was typed, the bore out there was typed from that book, and that's a way to get text into the hands of kids. I will say that we can't teach reading without something to read. So I worry sometimes that we tell kids about reading instead of engaging them in reading. So let's remember that however we want to do it, whether we project it, whether we make it downloadable, whether we take kids to a website, all of those are possibilities. Um, but we can't, in this new normal, we can't forget that to teach reading, you need something to read.
Great. Thank you so much, Dr. Wallis. And the next question that has come in, how do you recommend assessing students' ability to comprehend while working virtually outside of a multiple choice or short answer test?
Well, for sure, I've never felt that ABCD questions were particularly good ways to deeply assess comprehension. Writing is certainly useful. Where again, I think giving kids opportunities. Maybe offering kids 3 or 4 different questions or even statements the character is feeling, and then having kids complete those statements. I think also, if you can imagine right now a piece of paper with the text on the right side, excuse me, the left side, and down the right side, a column where kids are jotting their thinking as they're reading. And that is one of my favorite ways. You can do it with a poem, you can do it with a short piece of text, but it's almost like a double entry journal, except that the entry on the left is the text that you want kids to think about. Another possibility is genre transfer. So after reading an article, can you turn that article into a poem? And so can you transfer the information in one genre to another genre? Still, another way that I like is for kids to draw the narrative arc and for them to simply plot the a story plot on that arc. And by doing that, I'm able to see if kids are realizing where the conflict occurs, where the climax is, and where the resolution is. So that's another way. And then for informational text, for descriptive text, the big idea in a middle circle and the key ideas that go with that big idea in a kind of spider graph. And for chronologically developed text, for them to simply make a flowchart, a timeline, so that I see that they've resonated to the most important ideas in the text.
Great. Thank you so much. Let me see. We're getting a number of thank you so much. This is wonderful information. Lots of questions asking for the link to the webinar page, which I will put in the chat as well. And another questions about, I told you lots of people were very interested in the online book club. So, you know, if this is something that teachers haven't done in the past, how do you recommend launching an online book club?
Well, I think it works really in the same way as we did in the classroom. It's just that the kids are virtually engaged with each other rather than sitting in the same classroom. If the book is the book that's been being used in the book club is a single book, which has some advantages and has some disadvantages. We can jump on both sides of that. But the book club would begin with a very quick book talk over the book that we're about to read. And then we would create, and I have a form that I'm happy to post if anybody wants that. Uh, the decision is made on how we'll break down the reading. And so for chapter books, I typically, or novels, I typically have kids just put their fingers in the middle of the book and open the book and then go to the section to the front and open it again and look for chapter breaks. And so you would give kids the opportunity to read from page 1 to page 25 to be ready to engage in an online chat about the book. And then you'd need a few days again in between as the kids were reading the next section. If there are multiple books, so you offer kids the choice of, let's say, 6 novels. Again, you'll do a quick book talk. Kids will have an opportunity to virtually kind of explore the book and make a decision about their first and second choice. And in this case, the kids would read, probably have access to reading the text online. And then each book club would have their own schedule of pages to read and the dates when they're going to be participating in an online chat about the book.
Great. Thank you. Thank you so much, Dr. Wallis. And we have about 4 minutes left. So there's a number of questions. Apologies, I don't believe that we're going to be able to get to all of them today, but I did want to ask you, how do you recommend supporting our struggling and striving learners in this new distance learning environment?
So I think that I hope that I communicated one of the most important was, and that's making sure that we're creating scaffolds for those striving readers. Um, and so we would offer more of the type of text that I've annotated in some way to signal kids to stop and say something, to think about where their confusions might be. As I said earlier, I found that striving readers just keep reading, and then they get to the end of a text and they're lost, and it's too hard to go back and read again. But say something is a wonderful way to teach kids to monitor their own comprehension so that it's a whole lot easier to go back and reread 2 or 3 paragraphs than to even consider going back and reading a whole selection. I had and this was a very capable reader that I conferred with once, and she was so capable, I really didn't have a teaching point to make. And so I said to her, I said, "You're such a strong reader. Um, is there anything that I can help you with today as your teacher that would help you feel more confident as a reader?" And she was a 5th grader, by the way. And she said, "Well, yes, there is one thing you could help me with." She said, uh, I I'm reading along, and she said, "I realized that I haven't been thinking about what I've been reading." And she said, and I then I you know, I get confused, and And so I said, well, let me teach you something called Say Something. I said, you can make some places for yourself to stop and kind of summarize what you've read so far and think about questions that you have as a reader. And I said, there's not anyone who hasn't experienced that. So she had a big smile on her face, and she walked out of the conference that was one I did with a whole lot of teachers in the room. And we all smiled because no one had ever mentioned to her that she could make places for herself to stop and check in on her own understanding. The other thing that I think is so critical is making sure we differentiate text, even in this environment. And I want to call your attention once again to Freddie Hebert's site, textproject.org. She has sets of articles in 5 different levels, and in some cases, the topics are similar in the different levels. So, scaffolding, making sure that we offer kids some process support, and that means that we are helping them engage in those procedural strategies that make reading much more enjoyable, for one thing, as well as make the comprehension that we gain much richer.
Thanks, Dr. Wallis. And just to close it out, you shared a really inspiring quote from Brené Brown, and you have worked in teacher education for a number of years, many years. And just let's take a second and think about our teachers, and what advice do you have for novice teachers who are navigating this dramatic shift in the early stages in their careers? And then on the other side, what advice would you have for veteran teachers who are tackling this challenge of distance learning? To get your insight on that one.
Yeah, so laugh, smile, be kind to yourself. Teachers are heroes. Look at what we're doing. We're all, by the way, this new normal has leveled the playing field. We've all become learners, and we're all sort of navigating these unfamiliar waters as best we can. So I want us to remember that when we're learning new things, it's important for us to stop in that learning and reflect on what we're learning. So one of the things that I think we could all do is journal during this process. I hope we're all journaling anyway. But I know that I've encouraged the kids that are in my neighborhood that I see all the time. In fact, I've given them journals so that they'll write about some of the things that are happening right now. So be kind to yourself. I realized one of the things that I've done in my classes at the university is I've tried to clear away some of the things that we might have done had we all been in the same space at the same time. And so we've got to, I think less is more right now. We really, we want to give kids the opportunity to approach things thoughtfully. And that means that we need to slow down, and we need to think about whether we journal it or not. We need to think about what we're learning and the flexibility that we've had to somehow gain in this new kind of environment. One of the things that I always say to teachers when I work in professional development, and certainly when I work with novice teachers and pre-service teachers, is if we could have a test for tolerating ambiguity, it would be a terrific way to figure out who was going to do okay in education, because there are so few black and whites, and as educators, we need to tolerate ambiguity. We also have said for years we need to be the chief learner in a classroom, and oh boy, we are having an opportunity to make that happen. So teachers, you're my heroes. All educators are my heroes. And I tip my hat virtually to all of you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Wallis, for those words of encouragement. And yes, we appreciate our teacher superheroes, and we certainly appreciate you and giving your time, sharing your expertise, and for, we're all walking away with our heads a little bit higher. So thank you so much, and look forward to continuing the conversations. And thank you again, educators, for all you're doing for our students. Have a great evening, everyone. Thank you, Dr. Wallis.
Thank you.